Hey, we're continuing this sermon series called Ordinary Sinners. We've been looking at ordinary sinners like Adam and Eve, Noah, Moses, Rahab, Samson. Last week we looked at King Saul. And the interesting through line, all of this, is that God works through ordinary sinners. He works through just these ordinary sinners, and that's how he always does things. And so last week we looked at King Saul. We kind of saw his rise, but we saw severe character flaws with Saul, right? And we saw kind of his downfall as he comes. And today we're talking about David. We're talking about David. Now, David and Saul's story is kind of in the same book. That's the book of Samuel. And I hear what you're saying. You're like, Samuel is 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's two different books. Well, the reason why it's two different books is that it was just too much story for one scroll to hold, so they had to split it up, right? So they split it up, so it's all one story. It's all one thing that's being told about how God works amongst his people. In the very beginning of this story, the very beginning of it, we see Hannah, Samuel's mom, Samuel the prophet of God's mom, that Samuel's mom finally is able to be pregnant, and she says this song. She says a song, and it ends up we call it Hannah's song. And that song, right at the beginning here, is the thesis statement for Samuel. But not just Samuel, but almost how God interacts with his people throughout all time. And it says, God opposes the proud, but exalts the humble. Like that, God opposes the proud, but exalts the humble. And we saw that happen with Saul. Saul started getting a little proud on his stuff. He started making decisions, all these things on himself, started doing things to maintain his power, and he was brought down, right? Like he opposes the proud and exalts the humble. The story of David is about this song. It's about this. And his story shows it better than anything going on. So remember what God said about Saul at the end of last week's sermon. God says, I regret making Saul king. Can you imagine God saying that? It's like, I regret encouraging him to wear those jeans or something. I don't know. But can you imagine something like that? Like God opposes the proud, but exalts the humble. So he regrets over there. He tells Samuel, hey, go over to this guy named Jesse's house, and one of the kings, the new king, will come from Jesse. And so Samuel walks over to Jesse's house, and he goes over, assemble your sons. We're going to find a king today, basically, And he lines them all up, and Samuel's like, boy, this is going to be, all these sons are great. They're all tall, dark, and handsome, and all the things, things are going so great, and all of that. And we'll actually pick it up in 1 Samuel chapter 16, right here, right in this part of the story. And when they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. So he's like, look at how great this guy is. It doesn't get any better than him. But then the Lord said this, do not look at his appearance or the height of his stature. It's a very famous verse here. Or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. The man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Well, and as you're reading this in the context of everything going on, it's like he's saying, don't look at the world and how you see it. You're looking for power. You're looking for prestige. You're looking for all these things that will make you great. Everything will make you wonderful. All these things that you're looking for power. And the Lord doesn't look at those things. The Lord looks at what's going on the inside. The Lord looks what's happening inside there. And Saul's like, Samuel is like to Jesse, these boys aren't it. Do you have another son? Over there. He's like, well, yeah, we've got kind of the runt of the litter. I don't know if that's what he said. We got the little guy. He's out tending the sheep. There's no way Jesse would have brought David in, because there's no way the prophet of God would choose David. And he's like, well, bring him in. And he's tending the flocks. Bring him in. You could see like a small child running across the field or something like that. And he comes in. And we skip down a little bit, and it says, and he sent and he brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. I think it's interesting that when Samuel looks at him, he immediately puts on those physical attributes onto him. I think that's kind of talking about later in the story and kind of getting wrapped up in the power of everything. But so look at that, though. Think about, he was just left out in the fields. There's no way anyone would choose David, right? There's no one, it's showing us God opposes the proud, but exalts the humble. Another story of David that shows this really well is David and Goliath. This is like a classic Christian story. We know this from our childhood. We know this from our bones. David defeats Goliath, with a sling and a smooth stone. He just goes up and defeats him over there. There's two things that I think are fascinating about this story. So one of them is how it all happened. So David's still kind of a small boy, and what has happened is the Philistine army and the Israelite army have this standoff, and they bring their champion forward, which is this giant Goliath, and then they need one person to try to defeat Goliath. And everyone's too scared to do it. Like all the Israelites are like hiding and cowering behind their tents. They're like, you looked at me type of thing. And they're like, go away. And over there, and David stands up, and you can just hear his voice. Like you could tell like a young boy, like, I'll do it, type of thing. Like that. I don't know if any of you like play games, and you're in like a lobby and you're playing a game, and all of a sudden like the 11-year-old shows up. And none of you know exactly what I'm talking about at all. All right, yeah, fine. It's awful. They have the worst language. It's terrible. And you're just like, this high-pitched voice. That's what David sounded like. Like that. He's this little guy. He's like, I'll do it. Now, what I think is interesting is what happens next. Do you remember what Saul does for him? Does anyone remember what Saul does for David in this battle? King Saul invites David, this little boy, into his tent, and he gives him his armor. Now think about this armor. He's like, let's strap this armor onto you. That's like the best armor can be. That's the armor of a king. Like this is not just some infantry's armor. This is like the stuff. It's the best stuff ever. They're putting it on David, and it's over there. What is Saul trying to do for David there? He's trying to protect him. Yes. But he's also trying to here's how you can even have a chance in the battle to have the glory and the kingship, the glory and the power of the king on you, right? I'm going to protect you using my notions of power, right? I'm going to protect you. And we know that David's like, no, none of this works, man. None of this works. And he goes it all off, and he's got his little, it's always like a little loincloth thing I don't know. It's always a weird thing that they always picture David wearing. And he takes his slingshot after throwing off the powers of men, right? The power of the protection of men, throws it off, and with one stone, kills Goliath, right? Kills Goliath. Yeah, like that. That's what the story is. It's a story of humbleness. It's not trusting in the powers of men to do that. Now, the second thing that I always think is interesting about Goliath is after he defeats it, a lot of people will make the Goliath into a story like this. And I may mess with some of you on this, and that's my MO. I'm designed to mess with people in Bible stories. But that is that we often think David and Goliath, it tells me that as long as I trust in God, I can defeat the giants in my own day. I can just do that. I mean, I did a whole sermon on just this idea a few years back. You can probably look it up on YouTube or something like that. But yeah, I don't really see that. And here's why. The Olympics are in a week. Opening ceremonies are Friday. Does anyone like the Olympics in here? All right, yeah, good. Coley, my wife, is a huge Olympics junkie. She's saving up all of her TV time. That makes it sound like I'm 3 hours a day. That's not, she huge into the Olympics, loves it and all that. But what happens when we're watching the gymnasts or Michael Phelps isn't swimming this year, but when we watch the swimming and all that, when you're watching those people and they're doing the jumps and they're doing all this and all of a sudden they land it and everyone cheers and they win gold. What do we all say? We're we won, right? Like we won, like USA, like all those things, right? We win because their victory becomes our victory. Their identity is all wrapped up into ours in this kind of nationalistic sense, right? When David defeats Goliath, all those Israelites are all cowering and scared and on the side and peeking over there. And as soon as he beats them, they're like, ah, yes, you won. You did it. And like, yeah, we win. Yeah, that whole thing that they did with the Philistines across the way there, David's victory becomes their victory. You see that? You see, like that's a very kingly Messiah way of looking at the story, which I think is how it's written. I could be wrong about that. I'm not. So David defeats Goliath, and we can see this idea that God opposes the proud but exalts the humble. Now, we understand Saul's trajectory, right? We understand Saul, he rose to power, then got a little prideful in himself, and then like crashed back down. And while Saul is crashing back down, David kind of rises up, right? Now, in the last few years, I've learned a lot about King David. And my original notion about David, I don't think is correct. I don't think it's all that right. Because my original notion of David was that his prominence, he would rise up and like in his glory and all that stuff, and then he's like kind of maintained his righteousness throughout. Right? Is that kind of how other people viewed it too? Yeah, I'm sure he had like a little busty, but but by and large, like things are pretty good, right? That's not how Samuel was written. Samuel is written so it looks something like this. You have this rise of Saul and then his decline. And in the midst of Saul's decline, you see the rise of David. And David has a decline. What? What's all this about like Messiah stuff and all those things? Well, in our verse that we're talking about today is 2 Samuel chapter 7. And it is written here, right at the top of David's ascent, the top of his spiritualness, the top of who he is. And what it encompasses here is David, it's after Goliath, he's now king, he's won a bunch of battles, everything is going great, all this stuff, and he finds himself in his palace, and it's like a peaceful time, no one's fighting, no one's at war, and he's sitting in his palace, kind of looking around, and he looks out over the window, and he looks down, and he sees the tabernacle. He sees that God's temple, God's house, God's place is a Coleman tent that you buy at Walmart. Listen, it wasn't a Walmart tent. It was like a tent from REI. It was like canvas. It was good stuff. Do you guys know what REI is? I don't know. Anyway, so it's like a nice tent down there, but it's still a tent. And he's like, oh my goodness, God, like what? Like I live in this great palace and we just have you in a tent? And God ends up saying to him, it's like, hey, and David's like, well, let's build you a giant temple. Let's build it to your glory and your majesty. Let's do this. And David and God's like, I appreciate you talking to me like that. David, it's really nice. I like that. But let's not do that. Let's not build all that. But here's what I want to do. I want to build a legacy through you. I want to build a lineage through you. And he basically gives David a blessing that sounds a lot like that Abraham blessing. Now, if you remember the Abraham blessing, it's when God said to him, you will have so many people coming from, your descendants will be like the stars in the sky, right? Your descendants will be like the stars in the sky, and that all the nations of the world will be blessed through you, is what he did. He says that same thing of David. And let's actually read some of that right here. So it's 2 Samuel chapter 7. It says, now therefore, thus you shall say to thy servant David. That's God speaking to Samuel. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. You see what he's doing there? He's like, notice, I'm the one that has brought you up out of this. Sure, you were humble, David, but I have exalted you out of nothing. See that? See that? And it continues on. And I have been with you wherever you went, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones on the earth. So he's saying, like, I have brought you up and made you what you are. And we're going to skip a few of these. You can read this on your own time, but I'm trying to keep this as short as I can. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, when you die, I will raise up for your offspring after you. I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. And he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of that kingdom forever. Sounded very messianic right here, right? Like that, a lot of Messiah talk, like all that stuff, and we're continuing on with that. And I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. Christians are like, oh! And when he commits iniquity, what? I will discipline him with the rod of men, all right, with the stripes of the sons of men, but my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Psalm, whom I put away before. Now, we're not going to get into the whole when he commits iniquity stuff, because that would add like 15 minutes. But that sounds like Jesus, and it's meant to sound like it, right? It sounds like the Messiah talk about God, him establishing Jesus in this line of David. All right. Well, all of this happens right here at the top of him. So what happens? Well, after this great and grand blessing from God, David again goes to battle, has some great victories, and he's back at his house, and the story begins like this. David wasn't where he was supposed to be. David was supposed to be off with his battlemen and all of those things, and he wasn't where he was supposed to be. Is David now resting on his pride? Is David resting on what he has? It's like, I'm the king, I don't have to do that, right? I'm the king. And he ends up looking over the edge of his tower, and rather than seeing God's tabernacle, he looks over and he sees a young woman bathing. And he brings her up to his room, and they get jiggy with it, and she gets pregnant, and he kills her husband to cover it up. And he kills her husband to cover it up. Like that's like all of a sudden, like what? What is going on here? Like that's and Nathan, David's friend, confronts him, and that's what Cassie read earlier. Confronts him about it, and David does something because he's still at the ark of his holiness up here. He's still on the top of the ark of how good he's being, and he's being a humble servant. Like he's starting to show the bad signs of living in the pride, but he's still kind of up there. And Nathan goes, you did something really bad. And he doesn't go the way of Saul. He ends up going the way of humbleness just in here. And he confesses his sin. He confesses his sin, and he writes those beautiful psalms like Psalm 51 and myriads of others that the church and the people of God have for all time to bring us comfort in the times when we are struggling. But what ends up happening to David? And this is the part that kind of rocked my world for the last couple of years, is that after that time with Bathsheba, David's line just keeps going down and down and down. And we see at the end of his life, he's just a warlord king. And he ends up fighting with his own family, with his own sons, over who's going to sit on the throne. He ends up in these bloody battles with Absalom and all these other sons of his. And it ends up and just destroys everything around him in order so that he can keep his power. You know, he's trying to keep what is his. Even though God raised him from nothing, he's got a death grip on what he has now. And he's fighting from what they're going to take from us. I mean, he's fighting for what he's going to take from them. And his story ends in tragedy. If you don't believe me, read the last few chapters of 2 Samuel. It's a mess. Complete mess. But 2 Samuel chapter 7 lives on. And we see the Messiah, Jesus, come forth out of that story. Where David, he fought tooth and nail for everything that he had. Jesus freely ended up giving it up all the way. He was given an option. It's like, do you want to keep all this? And he humbled himself, even to the point of death, even death on a cross. That there's a phrase that I hear a lot today. There's a phrase that I hear a lot throughout people. We've got to fight. We've got to fight. They're trying to take it all from us. We got to stand up and fight. It could be anything. I don't know. That doesn't mean anything, that phrase. They're trying to take it from us. It sounds like David and Saul when they're at the bottoms of their backslides. It doesn't sound like a humble person trusting that God will lead them through. It sounds like someone desperately holding on to what they have so tight that they're white-knuckled and saying, I will find salvation when I fix it, or when I have someone that I like who will fix it, right? And we end up leaning into leaders like David at the end and Saul at the end, who will be strong men who will lead us through and keep them from stealing what is ours. But what I know is that even in the midst of the shambles and the darkness that is there, that God continues to work. That even though David ended up being just some ordinary sinner and left just the scorched earth underneath his reign of destruction and all that, that God still made the way for Jesus to come. I think about what Jesus came into. Israel basically didn't exist anymore. It was a sub-state of Rome. It had been destroyed years before, and they exist as a groupings of people. And Jesus comes into the scorched earth nature of there and brings blessing to all of us. Even us of maybe European descent, some of us others. But many of us are not Jewish. He even brought it to us, to the ends of the world, bringing us into that promise that was given to Abraham, that promise that was given to David. That God would lead us through, and God continues to work through all of that. That no matter what crosses we face, no matter what struggle we may cross in our lives, no matter what valleys of shadows of death we may find ourselves in, we know that we can rest. We can rest because in 3 days, Jesus rises. And he will rise us up as well. What I see from David is that God still works. And I don't know what scorched earth mess that you found yourself in right now. Maybe for some of you, it's a mental health thing. Maybe some of you, your family is just in shambles. You're able to put yourself together enough to make it not show, but you just are worried, sick, night and day about what's going to happen to them. Maybe you're under the water financially. I don't know what it is. We all have our different stuff where there's this. Our lives are just like, I don't know what I'm going to do. But the God worked through the scorched earth, ashy shambles of what David did to the kingdom of God to bring about blessing to the entire world. And he can do that through your life as well, your shambles as well, to bring blessings to your neighbors and to the people around you. And that's such good news. And I think I'll end right there. Let's say a prayer. Jesus, we thank you that you love us so much and that you're with us. Lord, humble our hearts. May we not seek after the powers of the world, but that we would seek after you and how you are working through us, Lord. Lord, open our eyes to the communities around us that need our love, need our grace, that need encouragement, Lord. And give us the courage to go forth into those places so that we, through the acts of your Spirit in your kingdom, may bring about good news in those places. Thank you, Jesus. Amen.